I call Denise Roach.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm deeply saddened to be speaking on this, the third and final reading of the Employment Relations Amendment Bill today. It's disappointing that this government has let old and outdated ideology dictate their legislative agenda. But perhaps it's not so surprising that this is the first legislation in this term of government when over the last 2 terms, what we've seen is this government consistently applying their policy directions towards the rich and the powerful, oil companies, property developers, Sky City Casino, to keep them rich and powerful, sir. In this case, the lobbyists include cleaning companies like Crest Cleaning, franchise company, who over the last 6 years have harangued MPs with their request that the government change the law to ensure that some of the lowest paid workers in this country lose their ability to maintain the small bit of job security that they have when a cleaning contract swaps over to another contractor. This is the business that sought to undermine the Building Services Association through their hired gun lobbyists and the blogger mates that was outlined in Nikki Haga's Dirty Politics books. During the submission process, sir, of the bill last year, I vividly recall the oral evidence from parliamentary cleaner Marita Sinotti. She spoke to the 2,000 or so written submissions that were presented to Parliament by the Service and Food Workers Union cleaners from cleaners throughout the country, and she spoke to their submissions. All of those submissions asked the government to back off on the removal of Part 6A of the Act, the clause that deals with the security for vulnerable workers like cleaners. And Marita was very thoughtful, and her submission was incredibly heartfelt. And I don't think I was the only one who had tears in my eyes as she essentially begged the Select Committee to not remove Part 6A. She talked about how, as a parliamentary cleaner, her job had been restructured several times. And while she'd kept her job, her hours had frequently been reduced and she had to do more work for less income in total. But she also said that she was proud to work for Parliament. Now, this is the worker who was insulted by a National Party Member of Parliament who suggested that she didn't like the job, it should go to someone else who wanted it. She earns less than $15 an hour, sir, for the privilege of cleaning up after us. And I guess it was this offensive remark from the Honourable Tau Henare that epitomises the hard-nosed approach that this government wants to introduce into the employment relations environment in New Zealand. The government says it wants flexibility, but in a labour market with a high unemployment rate, flexibility essentially vastly weaken workers' rights. That turns into low wages. And as others have said, a race to the bottom where the cheapest workers get the job. So to prepare for this reading, sir, I went back and I reviewed some of the 15,000 or so submissions to this bill. And the vast majority of them were for people like teachers, nurses, caregivers, dairy workers, engineers, and many more. And I want to thank them for participating in this democratic process. And it's a darn shame that the government hasn't taken on board any of their suggestions. But I also looked at the advice that was provided to the, around specific changes to the bill. And I looked at the regulatory impact statement. And in a column that measures the choice and flexibility against some of the changes to collective bargaining provisions, this is what it says. The proposal to repeal the 30-day rule for new employees, that would increase flexibility and choice for employers. The proposal to allow an employer to opt out of multi-employer bargaining with 40 days notice of initiation, that would increase flexibility and choice for employers, but decrease it for employees who want a mecca. The introduction of partial pay deductions for partial strike action, well, that's an increase in choice for the employers, but it also says here that this might see some new forms of action, and it could lead to an increase in intensity of partial strike action and a number of complete strikes. The provision to amend the timeframes when bargaining's initiative, that increases choice and flexibility for the employer. It decreases choice and flexibility for workers and their trade unions. Mr. Speaker, the object of the original Employment Relations Act 2000 is this. It's to build productive employment relationships through the promotion of good faith in all aspects of the employment environment and of the employment relationship. One, by recognising that employment relationships must be built not only on the implied mutual obligations of trust and confidence, but also on a legislative requirement for good faith bargaining. And two, by acknowledging and addressing the inherent inequality of power in employment relationships. And three, by promoting collective bargaining. And it goes on in part B to say, to promote observance in New Zealand of the principles underlying International Labour Organisation Convention 87 on the freedom of association, Convention 98 on the right to organise and bargain collectively. Sir, the government's changes absolutely undermine everything in these objectives, and regardless of whatever Weasley way the government wants to spin things, it takes away the obligation for employers to act in good faith towards their employees. Mr. Speaker, this bill is not only unprecedented, it is unwarranted. I have seen no compelling evidence that collective employment negotiations are bad for the economy, or that workers are holding the country to ransom through unreasonable demands. The amount of industrial unrest in this country has declined in recent years, an average of less than a dozen stoppages a year over the last several years. The most notable recent full-on disputes were the ports of Auckland and the MUNS workers, and the meat workers at Tally's AFCO, and even the current bank workers dispute with ANZ, and they have not been about demands for massive pay increases. They have been about holding on to their job security and opposing casualisation of the workforce and the demands that their employers have made for them to do that. In the case of Ports of Auckland and Tallies, the employer went so far to use industrial action themselves through lockouts to try and force those workers into making agreements around that, and they were locked out for weeks at a time. And so while the government says it may want to reduce the costs associated with collective bargaining, this appears to be a fallacy. Multi-employer collective employment agreements reduce costs for employers. They are a more efficient use of employers' resources because of economies of scale. Mr. Speaker, the government stated in the opening address from the Governor-General last week that one of their priorities for this term was to enact and enforce good workplace health and safety. And given that there were nearly 183,000 workplace injuries recorded by ACC in the last financial year, and workers in farming, forestry and fishing have a 1 in 4 chance of being injured at work, and that's not even factoring in the shocking number of deaths in these industries and on our ports, I might add. I absolutely applaud those aims of the government. But the changes in this legislation will not help with good health and safety practices. The bill creates an environment where New Zealand workers will be discouraged from speaking up about any of the health and safety risks on the job. They will not even have the simple right of a tea break during their work shift. And we know that in many high-risk industries, like forestry, for example, fatigue is a major contributor to accidents and injuries on the job. And we know too that health and safety is a culture that needs to be created on the job. And that means workers need to speak up. And we can see that difference in the exemplary health and safety record of the Huntly mine, which is highly unionised, and you compare that to the tragedy that was the Pike River mine. Mr Speaker, as a Parliament, we should do our best to provide legislation that supports and protects our citizens. I stand with the hundreds of thousands of workers in Aotearoa, New Zealand, who need legislation that protects their rights at work. Please oppose this bill.
Excellent.